Conflicts that Shaped Pharaonic Egypt. Lecture 2, Northeast Africa and the Land of Egypt, Origins of Pharaonic Culture.
Before we begin to look at the long prehistory and history of ancient Egypt, it is necessary to orient ourselves the way the ancient Egyptians did. The Nile River flows from south to north through Egypt. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians always look to the south. They face the south. To the south is Upper Egypt, the Nile Valley. To the north is Lower Egypt, the great delta of the Nile, where the channel fans out into multiple smaller channels leading into the Mediterranean. To our right hand is the Western Desert with its oases, and to our left is the Eastern Desert with the high, upthrust Precambrian mountains that form part of the Great Rift Valley system. Anywhere you want to live in the area of Egypt is down in a depression. The Nile Valley itself is cut by the Nile River over eons. The oases are just what their name implies. Our word oasis comes through the Greek from the ancient Egyptian wahat, meaning a cauldron, a great basin scooped out in the high desert plateau, deep enough, cut by millennia upon millennia of aeolian action, the wind and sand scouring down the depression until it comes into contact with subsurface waters flowing beneath Northeast Africa. Most of the land of Egypt is a high desert plateau, cut through by the Nile Valley and the oases, a high desert plateau with low-lying watered areas. Geographically, the ancient Egyptians divided their country between the Nile Valley and the Delta on the one hand, which they together called Kemet, the Black Land, a reference to the rich alluvial soil, and on the other, the desert, called Desheret, the Red Land. This essentially east-west dichotomy, Red Land and Black Land, running the length of the Nile Valley, was balanced by a north-south division. Lower Egypt, to the north, encompassing the Nile Delta, a broad fan of fields, swamps, and river channels, and Upper Egypt, the southern Nile Valley to the south of ancient Memphis, southwest of modern Cairo. The Nile Valley being a relatively narrow strip of cultivation bounded on the east and west by the desert escarpment. The opposition and balance that existed between the desert regions and the cultivated land, between the Nile Valley of Upper Egypt and the Delta of Lower Egypt, together created much of the character of Egyptian culture and propelled many of the major events of Egyptian history. The common daily perception of these major divisions, especially the stark contrast between the narrow strip of cultivated land and the great expanse of desert beyond, created a sense of dualism for the ancient Egyptians, whereby all objects, all concepts, even all events may be viewed as the ultimate equilibrium of balanced, often entirely opposing pairs. This desire to see order coming out of potential chaos, to see creation as the multiple subdivision of all of matter into the greatest number of potential paired elements, greatly influences how the ancient Egyptians see and interpret their world and the events of their history. We moderns think of the Nile as the heart of ancient Egypt. We have all read and heard the old Herodotian chestnut that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. This statement by Herodotus is based on the fact that the black alluvial soil of Kemet, of the Black Land, is the gift, the byproduct of the annual flooding of the Nile that went on from time immemorial until the completion of the Aswan High Dam. Primarily brought down from the Nile tributaries of Abyssinia, this black soil gives its name to one of the terms for Egypt. But Pharaonic civilization is in many ways more a gift of the desert. The culture of Pharaonic Egypt arose out of an interaction between more advanced, earlier desert culture and their points of contact in the Nile Valley. Points of contact that gave rise to groups who eventually would surpass those earlier desert cultures in both technology and iconographic complexity, and would lead ultimately to the earliest, greatest, and longest lived of all ancient civilizations. The most important early event that we need to examine when we begin to look at the formation of Pharaonic Egypt is the birth of a distinctly African Neolithic phase of human development, especially during the 9th millennium BCE. This African Neolithic is not dissimilar to the more classic Western Asiatic Neolithic, but it is profoundly different in its early lack of emphasis on sedentary agriculture and the small and somewhat geographically myopic farming community that we so often and equally short-sightedly see as the first and best bases of civilization. Ancient Egypt is the product not of the Neolithic revolution, but of an African Neolithic revolution. It is, in fact, to its distinctly African Neolithic origin that ancient Egypt almost certainly owes its great, all-encompassing, cosmic view of most aspects of culture and life. From about 2.5 million years ago until about 12,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern humans and early modern humans fashioned stone tools. And for over 1.5 million years of that period, during the earliest portion of that time, the flint technology remained nearly the same. Large hand axes made from a large piece of flint, shaped by knocking off flakes from each side, until a roughly triangular, multi-purpose tool was the end product. This technique of taking away outer debris to create the final surviving tool, the hand axe, is called a shulian. Slightly later, a flake technology develops. The tool is no longer the thing left when the detritus is removed. Rather, you take away the tools from the core, leaving what itself, the core, is the ultimate final detritus in the process, the so-called Lavoisian technique. The really big change, however, in North Africa and elsewhere, occurs between about 12,000 and 9,000 years ago. A 3,000-year period we usually call the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age. Now, the Neolithic has been traditionally defined as increased sedentism, meaning the creation of villages inhabited year-round and the concomitant domestication of plants and animals. The Neolithic Revolution, as it's sometimes called, is essentially the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to sedentary farmers. This classic archaeological definition of Neolithic is based on the ancient Near East, the so-called Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, northern Syria, and the Levant, not based on Africa. And in fact, this definition does not at all apply to the evidence for the African Neolithic. Between about 19,000 and 12,000 years before the present, note I say before the present instead of BCE, these are dates based on carbon-14, but without the ability to calibrate these dates. Between about 19,000 and 12,000 before present, sites in Upper Egypt, such as Wadi Kubaniya, slightly north of Aswan on the West Bank, demonstrate the intensive use of multiple food resources, hunting, fishing, and the gathering of wild plants, the harvesting of wild grasses. We know this from, amongst other evidence, from the sheens on some of the surviving flint tools to show that they had been used to harvest these grasses. But none of this leads to any sort of domestication again. Because no matter what progress those people in the area of Kubaniya in Upper Egypt might have made in developing the prototypes of cultivated plants, between about 12,000 and 8,000 before present, we have almost no evidence for human activity in the Nile Valley proper. This is the time of what is sometimes called the Sahabu Darao period, otherwise known quite descriptively as the time of the Wild Niles, when huge Nile floods were scouring out the Nile Valley and putting an end to any sort of human activities in the Nile Valley proper. This time period, interestingly enough, coincides with a wet phase in the Northeast African desert. And it is in this desert area where the true African Neolithic Revolution takes place. We can see that during the time of the Wild Nile, there were pressures on certain human populations. The old ways of life were not sufficient anymore. At a place in Nubia called Jebel Sahaba, archaeologists have found the remains of a massacred group of people, killed in a rather gruesome way, many of them shot through with arrows, some apparently hamstrung so the victors could come back and finish them off later. This extermination of a local group may in fact be related to the fact that the old life ways were no longer sufficient to support the population. The African Neolithic does not begin as a sedentary society, as we seem to see in the true, what we might call Western Asiatic Neolithic. The African Neolithic originates during a moist period in the Sahara, beginning around 12,000 before present, and firmly in place during the 9th millennium BCE, when we have evidence for the two most important aspects of the African Neolithic: advanced pottery production and cattle domestication. Early pottery in Africa is actually much more widespread than ceramic material in the ancient Near East, and the African pottery appears on the whole to be more technically accomplished. The pottery in North Africa is more widely available and better made than seems to be the case for the early pottery-producing cultures of Western Asia. These pottery-producing groups in North Africa are also cattle herders. But unlike their Neolithic Western Asiatic counterparts, they are not sedentary. They are not herding small herds of sheep, goat. They are not staying home on their farms domesticating plants. They are continuing to move through their environment to cover large amounts of territory in their annual peregrination. The reason for this is quite simple to understand. In addition to the Nile Valley and its wild Niles early on, in addition to the oases of the Western Desert with their permanent water supplies, northeastern Africa during this slightly moist period that sees the birth of the African Neolithic was the site of a large number of seasonal lakes, shallow mud pans that we call playas, that provided temporary and semi-permanent watering points. Cattle herding groups could and should move through this environment to take best advantage of all of the different watering sources. These semi-nomadic populations, these transhumant pastoralists and herders moved about their territories with their cattle and herds, exploiting wild grasses, plants, and continuing the hunting traditions of their ancestors. During the African Neolithic, we know that wild grasses were cultivated. There may in fact have been experiments with the potential domestication, even unbeknownst to those performing the experimentation, with crops such as millet and sorghum. But these experiments don't lead to any domestication event. The groups were mobile, and they were not influencing dramatically the plant populations at any single place, but rather very slightly over time. Changes in their own schedules, fluctuations in rainfall in any particular area, the water level in the playa at such and such a time of the year could very easily upset those very slight changes in the crops that human intervention might have brought about in local plant populations had these North African cattle herders settled down permanently. Barley and emmer, foundation crops of ancient Near Eastern agriculture, foundation crops of the Western Asiatic Neolithic, are in fact those crops that the ancient Egyptians ultimately adopted when at least some of them began to settle down. The pottery traditions that we see in the African Neolithic are not simple. They're rather complex. They show differences between the North and the South, and they reveal interactions of these Northeast African Neolithic groups over space. A general Southern style of pottery is well established by 7000 BCE at Khartoum on the Upper Nile. The Southern style is characterized by an all-over decoration, punctates, and other sorts of impressed designs. A Northern style, a plainer style, a style without this sort of overt decoration, but often with very complex surface treatments like ripple burnishing and polishing. This Northern plain style, distinguished by elaborate surface treatments, is well established by about 9000 BCE at Regenfeld in what is now called the Great Sand Sea, and is well in place in the western desert of Egypt, Dakhla Oasis, for example, by 7600 BCE. Within the southern tradition, we see an east-west dichotomy. There is what is called dotted wavy line pottery in the western desert, and simply wavy line pottery in the Khartoum cultures. And over time, we see interactions between these styles. The North African Neolithic, while it is developing very refined pottery styles and treatments, is remaining a mobile society covering great distances. These people are not farmers. They are not settling down. During the time of the birth of the North African Neolithic, the Nile is not the primary region of development. The Nile is a long, narrow water source, but it is simply one amongst many water sources in Northeast Africa. The Nile must wait a while before it becomes the focus of much of Egyptian culture. By 8500 BCE, at Bir Kaseba in the southwestern desert of Egypt, we have evidence for domesticated cattle. Genetic evidence and archaeological remains suggest that the North African domestication of cattle is a separate domestication event from cattle domestication in Western Asia, the ancient Near East, that occurs about the same time. Domesticated cattle spread rapidly across northern Africa, and linguistic evidence reveals it to have been present in the region of the Niger already by 7000 BCE. Between about 5500 and 5000 BCE, what we might call the Near Eastern Neolithic package enters Egypt. This being domesticated sheep and goat, the small herds, as opposed to the great cattle herds of the African Neolithic, and domesticated plants. At about the same time that this Near Eastern Neolithic package of sheep, goat, and domesticated plants comes into Egypt, the desert begins slowly its final period of desiccation. By this time, additional and increasingly important developments in Neolithic Egypt occur not in the desert areas, but in the Nile Valley. One thing we must remember is that just as Egypt is divided into Upper Egypt, the Nile Valley, and Lower Egypt, the Delta, so there are greater and ultimately more long-lasting differences between Upper and Lower Egypt. Whereas Upper Egypt is part of the development of the African Neolithic from its formative phases, the Delta looked more to the northeast, belonged more to that southern and southwestern tip of the Fertile Crescent. The Nile Valley looks to Africa and belongs exclusively to the African Neolithic, whereas the Delta is still part, an African fringe of the Near Eastern Neolithic. The first domesticated plants of the Near Eastern Neolithic tradition are imported into Egypt during the 6th millennium BCE, and we find them first attested in the Delta at sites like Merimda Beni Salama and in the small pseudo-oasis called the Fayoum, southwest of modern Cairo. Interestingly enough, however, the lithic styles, the styles of the flint tools in use in the Fayoum, belong to a Western desert tradition. And the same is true at Merimda Beni Salame, where we see a bit of a blend of African lithic technology and Southwest Asiatic influence. Curiously, however, the domestication of sheep-goat, the domestication of caprids, imported into Egypt from Western Asia, does not enter through the Delta, but based on our best understanding now from the archaeological record, apparently comes from Western Asia through Sinai, across the eastern delta, through the eastern desert, and into the upper Nile Valley. The broad reach of Upper Egyptian culture, the increased complexity and economic power of the still mobile North African Neolithic appears to outstrip the relatively narrow worldview of the increasingly sedentary Delta groups. Upper Egypt is importing leapfrogging over the delta in the importation of domesticated sheep and goat. This is not the first time that Upper Egypt will ultimately do better what we might expect the delta to do best. The various groups of the North African Neolithic, although centered at various points along the Upper Nile, in the oases of the Western Desert, and at seasonal lakes in that desert, such as Nabta Playa and Nukmani, were not cut off one from the other. They were linked with centers in the Nile Valley ultimately, such as Badari in Middle Egypt and the Kenabend region, the area of modern Luxor, and ultimately Khartoum in the south. These groups are not strung out along the Nile, nor are they an abandoned, strewn out group without interconnections in the Western Desert. They are, in fact, a checkerboard of cultures, with the Nile, an increasingly important area of access to water, connected by trade routes and trading amongst themselves. The fact that the North African Neolithic does not settle down as early as the Near Eastern Neolithic, the fact that these people continue to move about and live in a much wider, expansive world, has a great and ultimately transformative impact on pre-dynastic Egypt and the ultimate production of pre-dynastic Egypt, the Pharaonic state. Unlike the people living in the Delta, the foci of the groups in Upper Egypt and the Western Desert were not farming cities, but rather the roots of their travels and trade and the watering areas of their seasonal pasturage and hunting. By the end of the 7th millennium BCE, in Middle Egypt, by specifically around 6100 BCE at the site of Himamia, we see well-established a culture we call the Badarian. This is the first culture for which we can trace an unbroken line of development, ultimately leading us to the first dynasties of Pharaonic Egypt. The Badarian culture persists until around 4000 BCE and perhaps even later in some places. Badarian culture is typified by a very finely sifted, very finely levigated, highly polished, often ripple-burnished pottery that is amongst the finest and best ceramic productions on Earth. In Lower Egypt, around the same time, the cultures we call Fayum A and Merimda Bene Salame were in place. They are not as highly developed as the Badarian culture in terms of the quality of their material culture and in terms of the amount of material in their burials. The end of the Badarian culture in Upper Egypt sees the first of 3 cultural developments that we call Naqada 1, 2, and 3. These cultures take their name from the type site, the site where they were first clearly identified and put in order, the site of Naqada on the west bank of the Nile, just north of modern Luxor. The periods correspond roughly to the original divisions of pre-dynastic Egyptian culture of William Flinders Petrie. He called Naqada 1 the Ambracian period, Naqada 2 the Girzian period, and Naqada 3, a term most students of Egyptology don't even know, the Semanian period. By looking carefully at tomb groups in excavations, Petrie was able, through seeing the developments of pottery styles and iconography to put these tomb groups in an ordered sequence. Petrie's system has been refined somewhat, so the correspondences of Naqada 1, 2, and 3 are not exactly the same with the boundaries of Petrie's system, but they're really very close. These cultures, Naqada 1, 2, and 3, are found throughout Upper Egypt and increasingly in the Nile Delta. By the beginning of the Naqada 1 period, circa 4000 BCE, Upper Egypt is essentially a cultural and economic whole. The Naqada 1 culture is a wide-ranging, relatively homogeneous culture throughout the Upper Nile Valley. This does not mean that there is anything approaching political unity. This does not mean that the various burgeoning urban centers of Upper Egypt are all in some way politically interconnected. But technologically and economically and even iconographically, these groups are very wide-ranging and homogeneous throughout the Nile Valley. The same is not true in the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta, for a long time, remains somewhat of a patchwork of more locally distinct culture. The Naqada 1 period lasts from about 4000 to 3500 BCE. In contrast to the Badarians, the pottery forms are more closed. There are a larger number of forms that have some sort of a constriction to the mouth, even a neck involved. They're often vertically burnished, often red or brown with blackened tops produced in the firing process. We also begin to see geometric decorations, especially on the strangely named white cross line pottery, to use Petrie's term. White painting, often depicting geometric designs as well as animals and human figures. These designs often include hippopotami, hunting, even military scenes. For the first time, so far as we know, in North African culture, we begin to see ubiquitous images of the world and symbols of cosmic significance. On white cross line vessels, the sun travels between the mountains of the surrounding deserts. A hunter and his dogs corner a gazelle in the desert. A hippopotamus appears to lumber through the marshy environment of the Nile Valley. Some sort of visual information is imparted on many of the vessels of the Naqada 1 culture. And this becomes rapidly one of the great differences between the South and the North. Although we have very early evidence of sculpture, of ceramic plastic images in the North, in the Delta, the South becomes an increasingly symbolic society already by 4000 BCE. This symbolic society is heading towards the development of the hieroglyphic system and is separating itself out from the North in terms of greater use of symbols and an increasing hierarchy in society. We see certainly during the Badarian period and well in evidence during the Naqada 1 period, the fact that some people take more objects with them into their burials in Upper Egypt than do others. What this means about their status, how much more pots in your tomb translates to greater influence and authority in your former life, we do not entirely understand. But certainly symbolism is important in this society, and the symbolism has some association through the burial of these objects. The symbolism has some association with the other world. The Naqada 1 culture is well entrenched from Matmar in Middle Egypt on south to Hierakonpolis and even into Nubia, south of the First Cataract and Egypt proper. The Naqada II period, that begins around 3500 BCE and ends around 3250, is a period of great change. In the Delta, the so-called Mahdi culture, named for a site southeast of modern Cairo, is in place from about 3750 to 3250 BCE, so roughly coeval with the late Naqada I period and the Naqada II period in the south. The Mahdi culture finally is a slightly more wide-ranging culture than the earlier Lower Egyptian groups. As far as we know, it's in place from Buto in the north to Sedment in the south. Interestingly, this more wide-ranging Delta culture is employing certain objects we think of earlier as typically Upper Egyptian. Slate palettes for the preparation of cosmetics, disc-shaped mace heads, diorite jars, and even black-topped pottery. This includes not only imports from Upper Egypt, but rather pathetically unsuccessful local Delta attempts at copying the Upper Egyptian pottery. As one might expect, there are imports into the Delta from Syro-Palestine, including resin, asphalt, copper, even copper ore, etc. What we see by 3500 BCE in Upper Egypt is an increasingly complex symbolic culture that is encompassing all of the Upper Egyptian Nile Valley, in spite of whatever political differences and local traditions might exist in the various areas that have adopted that culture, whereas in the Delta, only late during the Naqada I period, only in the years around 3500 BCE, do we start to see a group with a broader reach, somewhat approximating what we see for Upper Egypt. And even that group is importing elements from Upper Egypt, as well as elements from Western Asia. The Delta is a crossroad and is behind Western Asia in terms of the Near Eastern Neolithic, and is behind Upper Egypt in terms of the North African Neolithic. It is an important meeting point, but it is not the place where the primary events will occur that will lead to the origin of the Pharaonic state. That will happen during the Naqada II period in Upper Egypt.